Out in the black between stars, the colony ship Avalon glides like a floating city, sleek, silent, and supposedly flawless. It's on a decades-long voyage to Homestead II, carrying a small army of crew and thousands of passengers, all sealed away in hibernation like priceless cargo. No footsteps, no laughter, no life, just machines steering a dream toward a distant world. Then space does what space always does. It throws a curveball. Avalon slices into a dangerous field of debris. Its defenses strain, systems shuffle power to keep the ship protected, and for a moment it looks like the worst will pass. But one massive impact changes everything. The collision doesn't explode the ship into dust. Avalon is built to endure, but it leaves behind a chain of quiet, creeping failures. The kind you don't notice at first, until it's far too late. Somewhere deep in the hibernation bay, one pod glitches, and a man wakes up when he absolutely shouldn't. His name is Jim Preston, a mechanical engineer who signed up for a fresh start. An automated system guides him through the standard awakening routine, as if this is all part of the plan. Stretch, breathe, adjust, enjoy the luxury cruise of the future. Jim is disoriented but excited until he steps outside and realizes the ship feels wrong. Empty wrong, like a hotel that never opened. He wanders into a training session meant for a room full of new arrivals, only to find himself staring at a lesson designed for crowds. He tries to interact, tries to make it make sense, but the system is built to perform, not to answer a nightmare. So Jim starts hunting for people. He checks the public areas, the service points, the places where human voices should be. He asks for crew assistance, tries to reach authority, even pushes toward the command level, but every route ends the same way. Locked access, empty halls, and silence behind glass. When he finally reaches a place where the ship's true journey can't be hidden, an observatory window framing the endless stars, he learns the horrifying math. The ship isn't months from its destination, it's still decades away. He wasn't meant to wake up, not now, not alone. Panic becomes routine. He sends a desperate message back toward Earth, clinging to the idea that someone somewhere can tell him how to reverse this mistake. The ship's communication system responds with an icy reality. Answers won't come quickly out here. In fact, they won't come in anything resembling a human lifetime. That's when it hits him, fully, violently. Jim isn't stuck on a ship for a long trip. He's stuck on a ship for the rest of his life. At first, he tries to solve it like an engineer. He tears into the tech behind the pods. He studies manuals, raids maintenance closets, and treats the problem like a broken machine that just needs the right sequence of steps. But each attempt ends in failure. The hibernation systems won't re-engage for him. The crew section is sealed off in a way he can't bypass. The ship was designed so passengers can't tamper with the controls, and now that design becomes a prison. Meanwhile, the ship keeps whispering that something is off. Minor glitches flicker through daily life, harmless at first, like a luxury liner getting old. But Avalon isn't supposed to get old, not mid-voyage. With no one else to talk to, Jim drifts toward the ship's bar, one of the few places that still feels remotely human. That's where he meets Arthur, the bartender. Except Arthur isn't human. He's an android with perfect manners, smooth service, and a face that never changes. And weirdly, that makes him the closest thing Jim has to a companion. Night after night, Jim returns, sometimes to drink, sometimes just to hear a voice that answers. Arthur offers friendly guidance, and Jim tries to distract himself the only way he can, by turning Avalon into his personal playground. He sneaks into areas meant for the elite, samples experiences reserved for the wealthy, and throws himself into entertainment like it can fill the shape of loneliness. But loneliness doesn't get bored, it gets heavier. Months bleed into a year. Jim's world shrinks into routines, eating the same food he can access, walking the same halls, listening to the same artificial cheer. The ship is a palace with no people in it, and Jim is the one ghost haunting its corridors. Eventually, he reaches a breaking point. He finds suits designed for spacewalks, steps outside the ship, and floats in the raw quiet of the cosmos. The view is breathtaking in the cruelest way, because it's beautiful and meaningless when you're the only person alive to see it. For a moment, he flirts with the idea of letting go of everything, ending the story right there in the cold. He comes back in, but he doesn't come back whole. Because after that, he returns to the hibernation bay and notices someone. A woman asleep behind curved glass, her face peaceful, her life untouched by the nightmare he's living. Her name is Aurora. Jim learns about her through ship records and personal archives, and the more he discovers, the more she becomes an idea in his mind. Warmth, conversation, connection, proof that he wouldn't have to rot alone, and that idea becomes dangerous. At first, he fights it. He knows what waking her would mean. It wouldn't just be companionship. It would be condemning another human being to the same fate, stealing a life she chose, and replacing it with a cage made of steel and starlight. But the ship keeps stretching time, and loneliness keeps sharpening its teeth. One day, Jim stops resisting. He activates Aurora's pod and watches the ship do what it was designed to do, bring her back to life. And then, ashamed of what he's done, he disappears before she can see him. When Aurora finally steps into the empty Avalon, she reacts exactly the way any person would. Confusion turns to fear, then disbelief, then panic. Jim presents himself as another victim of a system failure, guiding her through the first awful realizations. They're alone, the crew can't be reached, and there's no easy way back into sleep. Aurora is devastated. She wants her pod. She wants her future. She wants the life she paid for. And Jim stands there, pretending he didn't just rip it away. Guilt gnaws at him, so he makes one request of Arthur: keep the truth buried. Arthur doesn't grasp human morality the way humans do, but he agrees in the only way he can, by following the request as a rule. For a while, it almost works. Aurora, unlike Jim, refuses to surrender quickly. She searches. She studies medical systems. She investigates ship files. She tests locked doors and sealed corridors like determination alone might pry Avalon open. Jim watches it all, quietly shaken, because he remembers when he still had that kind of fight in him. Over time, her resistance softens, not because she accepts the situation, but because the ship keeps proving that hope has limits out here. She pours herself into writing, into movement, into anything that makes the days feel less like a punishment. She also turns her curiosity toward Jim, digging into his reasons for leaving Earth, trying to understand the kind of person who would trade one world for another. Their conversations grow, so do the silences between them. Aurora reveals that she didn't see Homestead II as a one-way escape. She imagined returning, bringing back a story no one else could possibly tell, a journey across light years and back, documented by a living witness. It was supposed to make her name. It was supposed to be her masterpiece. Instead, she's trapped in the middle of it. Jim tries to pull her from the edge the way he wishes someone had pulled him. He shows her the ship's wonders not as luxury, but as a way to make the prison feel less like a tomb. They dance. They watch old films. They play games that feel ridiculous until they feel necessary. And through it all, attraction grows, slow at first, then undeniable. There's a moment where it stops being survival and starts being love. They share the observatory, share the stars, share the ache of being awake while the universe sleeps. Jim starts building small things just to give the days texture, little gestures that say, "I see you, I'm trying." He discovers a hidden section meant for growing food and plants and brings Aurora living beauty, something fragile in a place built from metal. They become a couple. They move like a pair through Avalon's empty grandeur, writing their own version of life. For a while, it's almost peaceful. Then the truth detonates. On a night that should have been special, one of those rare moments where Jim wants to mark time with a gift and a promise, Aurora ends up talking to Arthur. Arthur, unaware that he's holding a loaded weapon, casually reveals the secret Jim has kept buried. Aurora's world collapses in an instant. Everything, every kindness, every laugh, every touch, rearranges itself into something darker. Because now it isn't two victims finding comfort in tragedy. It's one man creating the tragedy and then asking for comfort inside it. Aurora's reaction is violent, messy, human. She flees from him, from the places they shared, from the life she thought they were building. She rips her belongings away from his space as if she can tear his lie off her skin. When he tries to speak, she escapes. When he tries to explain, she refuses. When he tries to apologize, it bounces off a grief too massive to absorb it. He didn't just wake her up. He stole her future, her choices, her entire timeline, and she can't forgive that. As their relationship rots into separation, Avalon's condition worsens. The ship's little glitches become bigger, more frequent, more threatening. Machines malfunction. Systems hiccup. Things that should be routine start turning dangerous. Then something happens that changes the equation entirely. A third person awakens. Gus Mancuso, the ship's deck chief, stumbles into consciousness with authority, experience, and immediate alarm at what he's seeing. Unlike Jim and Aurora, Gus has access. His ID band acts like a master key, letting him reach areas the passengers never could. He doesn't understand how multiple pods could fail. He doesn't like what he's hearing. And when Jim's role in Aurora's awakening becomes clear, Gus reacts with disgust that Jim can't argue away. But Gus has bigger problems than moral judgment, because the ship itself is sick. Avalon systems are compensating for a damage event that happened long ago, quietly shifting strain from one place to another, like a body trying to function with a failing organ. And now it's reaching a point where the entire vessel could collapse. If that happens, everyone on board, thousands of sleeping people, dies without ever knowing what hit them. Gus begins a manual investigation, forcing the ship to reveal what its automated reporting has been masking. But the man is also paying a price. Something about waking early is hurting him, and it's getting worse fast. He coughs blood. his strength fades, he's running out of time, then the ship nearly kills Aurora. A sudden failure in gravity turns a peaceful swim into a drowning trap. Water becomes a weapon when physics breaks, and Aurora barely survives long enough for the system to recover. It's a brutal reminder. This isn't just emotional suffering anymore. This is a ticking clock. Together, Jim and Aurora carry Gus to the ship's medical facility, hoping the futuristic tech will save him. But the clinic is built for passengers meant to wake at the right time, not for someone breaking the rules of the voyage. There's no miracle. Gus is dying, and the ship can't fix that. Before he goes, Gus hands Jim the one thing that can give them a fighting chance, his access, his authority, the keys to Avalon's heart. Then he dies, leaving two broken people alone again, except now the ship is screaming. Alarms shift the lighting, the vessel shudders, systems fail in rapid succession. Even Arthur collapses into shutdown when the malfunction spreads through internal networks. The Avalon isn't glitching anymore, it's unraveling. Jim and Aurora force themselves into motion. Whatever hate sits between them has to wait. Thousands of lives are sleeping. If the ship falls apart, everyone dies. So they race into engineering, following the trail of failing systems toward the core problem. And when they find it, the ship tries to swallow them. A breach threatens to pull them into vacuum. Metal screams. Air rips away. They fight the ship like it's a beast, sealing the damage at the last moment. But it's not just one wound. The original impact left a path of destruction. Multiple strikes, multiple failures, each one now demanding payment. The most terrifying damage is buried in the reactor systems. Cooling fails. The ship can't vent heat. Temperature climbs toward catastrophic levels. If the reactor goes, the journey ends in fire, and everyone on board becomes ash drifting in the dark. Jim believes he can repair it. Aurora helps even with every emotion still raw, because the alternative is unthinkable. They replace components. They attempt system resets. They try everything the manuals recommend. Nothing works. Finally, Jim realizes the only way to release the pressure is from outside the ship. It's the kind of solution no one should ever have to attempt mid-flight, manual intervention in open space. He prepares for a spacewalk with the kind of calm that only comes when you've accepted the worst outcome. He gives Aurora Gus's access band, because if he doesn't return, someone still has to finish the job. Aurora helps suit him up with trembling hands. She doesn't want to lose him, especially not after everything, especially not now that she knows how deeply he's already been punished. Jim steps out into space again, but this time he isn't alone in the universe. This time, someone is waiting inside who would feel the silence he leaves behind. As Jim reaches the external vent, the reactor chamber inside becomes a nightmare. Heat surges, a violent mechanical failure injures Aurora. Still, she stays on task. The ship must be saved. Jim reaches a horrifying conclusion. He may have to physically hold the vent open long enough for the reactor to purge. It's not heroic in the glossy, cinematic sense. It's desperate, it's ugly math. A life traded for thousands. Aurora fights him on it. She doesn't want to authorize his death, but there's no time left for debate. The reactor is seconds from the point of no return, and in the end, Aurora makes the choice no one should ever have to make. She triggers the venting. The reactor purges. The ship survives, but the force blasts Jim away. His tether snaps. His suit begins to fail. The void takes him like it almost took him before, and this time there's no easy way back. Aurora refuses to accept it. She races for another suit, launches herself into open space, and goes after him. It's chaotic and terrifying. Human bodies are not meant to chase each other through vacuum. She nearly gets dragged back, nearly loses her own life, but in a last burst of desperation, she catches him and pulls him home. She drags his limp body to the medical bay, running on adrenaline and grief, and it looks like she's too late. But Gus's access band changes everything. Aurora overrides the medical protocols and forces the system to attempt revival. The ship's automated medicine takes over, and against the odds, Jim comes back. When he opens his eyes, something has shifted. Not the past, not the damage, not the brutal truth of what he did. But Aurora, somehow, has reached a place where she can let go of the blade she's been holding to her own heart. She forgives him, not because what he did was acceptable, but because they've stared down extinction together, and the ship has demanded more from them than anger can carry. And because the person she's become out here has learned that survival isn't just breathing, it's choosing what to do with the time you have left. They repair Arthur. They honor Gus the only way they can, sending him into the stars with a final, quiet respect. And then Jim brings Aurora to the infirmary and shows her something that changes everything again. The ship's medical technology can be adapted. Not a true hibernation pod, but close enough to carry one person through the remaining years. Jim offers her an escape, a chance to sleep through the rest of the trip and wake up to the life she was promised. Aurora stands at the edge of that choice, freedom on one side, Jim on the other. And she makes the decision that defines the rest of her story. She stays, not because she's trapped, not because she has no options, because she chooses him. She chooses the strange, painful, hard-earned life they've built inside the empty belly of Avalon. Jim proposes, and in a ship built for thousands, they live as two, turning sterile corridors into something that feels like home. He plants life. She writes history. And the years pass not as a sentence, but as a shared existence. Decades later, long after their arguments have turned into memories, long after the ship's crisis has faded into legend, Avalon finally reaches Homestead II. The crew awakens, then the passengers. They step into a vessel that looks nothing like the polished luxury ship they boarded. It's been reshaped by human hands, softened by time, transformed by two people who refuse to let a silent world stay silent. And waiting for them is Aurora's message, an account of what happened, what was lost, what was saved, and what it cost to stay awake while everyone else slept. Analysis: what if you woke up and the entire world was gone, not destroyed, not invaded, just unreachable? Imagine opening your eyes and realizing you're floating through deep space, 120 years away from your destination, and every single person around you is asleep. And you woke up 90 years too early. That's the terrifying premise of Passengers, 2016. But this isn't just a space survival movie. It's not just a love story either. It's a film built around one deeply uncomfortable question. What would you do if loneliness was going to be your entire future? At first glance, Passengers looks like a sleek, futuristic romance set aboard a luxury spaceship. Beautiful visuals, stunning production design, two charismatic leads, a glossy sci-fi adventure. But beneath that polished surface lies something much darker. This movie isn't about space. It's about isolation. It's about morality. It's about the consequences of one irreversible decision made in a moment of emotional desperation. And that decision changes everything. Over the next few minutes, we're going to break down the story, the ending, the hidden symbolism, the controversy, and why Passengers remains one of the most debated sci-fi films of the last decade. Because once you strip away the romance and the spectacle, you're left with a question that hits uncomfortably close to home. If you were completely alone forever, would you make the same choice? Let's dive in. Before we go deeper, let's understand what Passengers actually is and why its premise is so powerful. Released in 2016, Passengers is a science fiction romantic drama directed by Morton Tildum. On paper, it sounds simple, a futuristic space journey gone wrong, but the simplicity is what makes it so gripping. The story is set aboard the Avalon, a massive interstellar spacecraft carrying over 5,000 passengers and crew members. Their destination, a distant colony planet called Homestead II. The journey will take 120 years, so everyone on board is placed in hibernation pods, designed to keep them asleep until arrival. It's a one-way trip to a brand new life in a brand new world. Everything is automated, everything is controlled, everything is perfect, until something malfunctions, and one passenger wakes up 90 years too early. That's the entire spoiler-free premise, and it's already terrifying, because this isn't a broken engine problem. It's not an alien invasion. It's not an external threat. It's isolation. A single human being, conscious and alone, drifting through deep space with no way to go back to sleep. The film blends multiple genres: science fiction, spectacle, psychological, survival drama, intimate romance, moral dilemma. Visually, the movie is stunning. The spaceship feels like a luxury resort in space. Grand dining halls, robotic bartenders, holographic interfaces, panoramic views of stars stretching into infinity. But that beauty becomes haunting when you realize one thing: all of it is empty. And that's what makes Passengers so compelling. It's not just about space travel. It's about what happens when technology fails and humanity is left alone with its thoughts. And from this quiet, isolated setup, a decision is made that drives the entire story forward. Now that you know the world and the premise, let's break down the deeper themes hiding beneath the surface. On the surface, Passengers looks like a glossy sci-fi romance set in deep space. But the real power of this film isn't in its visual effects. It's in its themes. Because Passengers quietly blends multiple genres, and each one adds a new emotional layer to the story. Let's break it down. 1. Isolation, the core of everything at its heart. This is a story about isolation. Not the kind where you're stuck in a room for a few hours. The kind where you're cut off from humanity forever. The film spends a surprising amount of time showing loneliness in its rawest form, routine turning into madness, silence becoming unbearable, and hope slowly fading. And that's important. Because before this becomes a love story, it's a psychological survival drama. You're watching a human mind struggle against endless emptiness. 2. Ethics and consent, the controversial core. This is where the movie becomes divisive. At the center of the story is a moral decision that sparks debate even today. Is companionship a human need, or does desperation excuse nothing? The film forces viewers into an uncomfortable position. You understand the pain of isolation, but you also understand the cost of selfish choices. And that tension is intentional. It's designed to make you question where empathy ends and accountability begins. 3. Love versus survival. Unlike many space films that focus purely on survival mechanics, Passengers ask something deeper. Is emotional survival just as important as physical survival? The romance in this film isn't just about attraction. It's about two people clinging to meaning in a place where meaning shouldn't exist. Space becomes the backdrop, but the real story is about human connection. For redemption, as the story progresses, it shifts again. It becomes about consequences. Can a terrible decision be redeemed through sacrifice? Can love survive betrayal? The tone moves from wonder to intimacy to guilt to high-stakes survival. And that tonal shift is deliberate. It mirrors the emotional arc of the characters. Who is this movie really for? This isn't a pure action sci-fi film. It's for viewers who enjoy character-driven storytelling, ethical dilemmas, emotional tension, sci-fi with philosophical weight. If you're expecting non-stop explosions, you might be disappointed. But if you're drawn to stories that ask uncomfortable questions about human nature, this one hits hard. Because at the end of the day, Passengers isn't about space. It's about what happens when loneliness pushes someone to cross a line, and once that line is crossed, there's no going back. Now that we understand the themes, let's walk through the full story step by step and see how everything unfolds. Alright, now let's walk through the full story of Passengers step by step and see how one malfunction turns into a life-altering chain reaction. The awakening. Jim Preston wakes up suddenly inside his hibernation pod. At first, it feels routine, a standard arrival procedure, but something's wrong. The ship's destination is still 90 years away. There are over 5,000 passengers on board, and every single one of them is still asleep. He tries everything, contacting the crew, accessing the ship's systems, even forcing his way into restricted areas. But the Avalon is fully automated. There's no override, no manual reset, and most terrifying of all, there's no way back into hibernation. Jim slowly realizes the truth. He is going to live and die alone in space. The descent into loneliness. Days turn into months. Months turn into a year. The luxury spaceship becomes a prison. He eats alone, talks to automated machines, wanders through endless empty hallways. The silence grows heavier. Hope fades. We watch him deteriorate, not physically, but emotionally. The isolation becomes unbearable. He even contemplates ending his life rather than facing decades of solitude. This is where the movie shifts from sci-fi spectacle to psychological drama, because the real enemy isn't space. It's loneliness. The decision that changes everything. While wandering through the passenger database, Jim comes across Aurora Lane, a writer traveling to the new colony to document its future. He reads her profile, watches her interviews, learns about her dreams, and he becomes attached to someone who doesn't even know he exists. He wrestles with the idea for weeks. If he wakes her up, she'll be trapped too. Her future's stolen, her life permanently altered, but if he doesn't, he dies alone. Eventually, desperation wins. He makes the choice, and Aurora wakes up, believing it was an accident. Love, lies, and betrayal. At first, they're confused, then bonded by shared confusion. Slowly, connection grows into romance. For a moment, it feels like fate. They laugh, dance, explore the ship. They build a life inside a floating world of emptiness, until the truth comes out. Aurora discovers that Jim intentionally woke her, and the betrayal cuts deep. Everything they built collapses instantly. Now the isolation isn't external anymore, it's emotional. Two people on the same ship, divided by trust. The crisis. Just as their relationship shatters, the ship begins malfunctioning. Systems fail, gravity collapses. Mechanical sections flood. It turns out Jim's early awakening wasn't random. The ship was damaged by an asteroid strike, and cascading failures are spreading. A crew member briefly awakens due to system errors and reveals the horrifying reality. The Avalon is dying. If they don't repair the reactor, every sleeping passenger will perish before reaching the colony. Now the story transforms again. It's no longer about loneliness. It's about survival for 5,000 lives. And for the first time, Jim is given a chance to do something selfless. What happens next leads us directly to the film's most debated ending. Let's break that down next. Now let's talk about the ending of Passengers, because this is where the film tries to answer its biggest moral question. After the ship's systems begin catastrophically failing, Jim and Aurora discover the truth. The Avalon was struck by a massive asteroid years ago. The damage has been slowly spreading, corrupting its core systems. The fusion reactor, the heart of the ship, is overheating. If it explodes, 5,000 sleeping passengers die instantly. There's only one solution. Someone has to go outside the safety of the ship, manually vent the reactor, and reset it from an exposed maintenance chamber. It's essentially a suicide mission, and Jim doesn't hesitate. The sacrifice this moment is critical. Earlier in the film, Jim made a deeply selfish choice, waking Aurora to save himself from loneliness. Now he's faced with the opposite decision: risk his life to save everyone else. He steps into space, faces extreme radiation, manually opens the reactor vent. The explosion nearly kills him. For a brief moment, it looks like he's gone, but Aurora refuses to give up. Using advanced medical equipment from the ship's autodock system, she manages to revive him. It's a symbolic reversal. Earlier, he took her life's future away. Now, he nearly gives his life back in return. The final choice after the crisis is resolved. A shocking discovery is made. The medical pod can place one person back into hibernation. Aurora now has an option. She can go back to sleep. She can live the life she was meant to have. She can wake up on the colony planet decades later, young with her dreams intact. And Jim, he would be alone again for the rest of his life. The film doesn't dramatize this decision with heavy dialogue. Instead, it quietly shows us the outcome. Aurora chooses to stay. What does the ending really mean? Years later, when the ship finally reaches its destination, the passengers awaken to something unexpected. The sterile metallic Avalon has been transformed. Trees, plants, a living ecosystem. Jim and Aurora didn't just survive. They built a life. They turned a machine into a home. Thematically, the ending suggests three major ideas. Redemption is possible, but only through sacrifice. Love, even if born from a flawed beginning, can evolve into something genuine. Meaning isn't found in destination, it's created in the journey. But here's where the debate begins. Did Jim truly earn forgiveness? Did Aurora genuinely choose freely, or was her decision shaped by emotional dependency? The film doesn't answer that directly, and that ambiguity is intentional. Because Passengers isn't trying to give you a clean moral resolution, it's asking you to sit with discomfort. Jim's arc moves from selfish survival to selfless sacrifice, but whether that balances the scales, that's up to you. And hidden throughout the film are subtle symbols and details that make this ending even more layered than it first appears. Let's uncover those next. Now here's where Passengers becomes more interesting than most people realize. Because beneath the romance, beneath the controversy, the film quietly plants visual metaphors and symbolic moments that deepen the story. Let's break down the hidden layers you might have missed. The malfunctioning pod, fate or consequence. The entire story begins with a single malfunction. Jim's hibernation pod fails. At first, it feels random, a mechanical accident in deep space. But symbolically, it represents something bigger: loss of control. The passengers believe technology guarantees their future. Everything is calculated. Everything is automated. Yet one small failure changes thousands of destinies. That broken pod becomes a metaphor for how fragile certainty really is. And later, Jim mirrors that malfunction. Just as the pod disrupts his life, he disrupts Aurora's. The bar and the android bartender. Nearly every major emotional confession happens at the ship's bar. Why? Because the bartender isn't human. He's an android programmed to respond, but not to judge. This makes him the perfect symbolic stand-in for Jim's conscience. Jim confesses his fears there, his loneliness, his moral conflict. He's speaking out loud, but in reality, he's arguing with himself. The bar becomes a confessional booth in space. The pool scene, control versus chaos, one of the most visually striking moments in the film, is the zero-gravity pool sequence. When gravity shuts off, the water lifts Aurora into a floating sphere, trapping her inside. It's beautiful, it's terrifying, and it's symbolic. Throughout the film, the ship represents structure and order. When gravity fails, chaos takes over instantly. That moment visually represents the emotional state of the characters. Their carefully built life can collapse at any second. The garden turning a prison into a home. By the end of the film, the once sterile Avalon is filled with plants and trees. This isn't just aesthetic decoration, it's symbolic transformation. Metal becomes life. Cold technology becomes warmth. Isolation becomes growth. Jim and Aurora don't just survive the journey, they reshape it. The garden represents acceptance. Instead of fighting their reality, they choose to create meaning inside it. Foreshadowing in early dialogue early in the film, Aurora talks about wanting to write a story that matters, something meaningful, something lasting. In the end, she doesn't write about a colony planet. She becomes part of a story far more intimate, one about choice, consequence, and building life where none was planned. The film subtly hints from the beginning that her journey won't unfold the way she expects. The bigger symbol space in Passengers isn't just a setting, it's a mirror, infinite, silent, empty. At first glance, Passengers looks like a sleek science fiction romance set in deep space. It has the massive spaceship, the futuristic technology, the beautiful visuals, and the kind of polished Hollywood presentation that makes it feel like a grand interstellar adventure. But underneath all of that, the film is asking something much quieter and much more disturbing. Because this is not just a story about space, it's a story about isolation, it's a story about loneliness. And more than anything, it's a story about what happens when a human being is left alone for too long with nothing but silence, routine, and the unbearable weight of their own thoughts. That's where Passengers becomes more than a conventional sci-fi film. Strip away the spaceship, the cryopods, and the distant colony planet, and what you're really left with is an emotional nightmare. A man wakes up decades too early, completely cut off from humanity, trapped inside a machine built for thousands but inhabited by no one. He has food, he has shelter, he has luxury, he has endless space around him. But none of it matters, because comfort is not the same as connection. And that is one of the film's most powerful symbolic ideas. You can surround a person with beauty, technology, and convenience, and they can still emotionally collapse if they are truly alone. The Avalon itself becomes a symbol of that contradiction. On paper, it's a paradise. It's elegant, advanced, and filled with every service imaginable. But the more time Jim spends wandering through its empty halls, the more it stops feeling like a dream and starts feeling like a prison. The giant dining rooms, the polished corridors, the observation decks staring into endless darkness, all of it begins to reflect not wonder, but emptiness. The ship is beautiful, but it's hollow. And in that sense, the Avalon becomes more than a setting. It becomes a physical representation of isolation itself, vast, silent, functional, and completely indifferent to the emotional fragility of the person trapped inside it. That's what makes the loneliness in Passengers feel so unsettling. It's not loud, it's not dramatic in an obvious way. It doesn't come through screaming or chaos. It comes through repetition, through silence, through routine, through the slow realization that no one is coming, that every day will look like the last, that every conversation is either with a machine, a screen, or your own thoughts. And that kind of loneliness changes a person. That is the deeper human vulnerability at the center of the film. Jim is not just physically isolated, he is psychologically exposed. With no society around him, no moral structure, no emotional support, and no hope of rescue, the film places him in the most dangerous position possible, alone with his despair. And that's what makes Passengers more psychologically interesting than many people give it credit for. It understands that loneliness is not just sadness. Loneliness can distort judgment. It can weaken morality. It can make desperate choices start to feel reasonable. The longer the silence lasts, the more the mind begins to justify what it once knew was wrong. That's where the film becomes deeply uncomfortable, because it is not simply asking, what would you do to survive? It's asking, what would loneliness turn you into? And that question gives the entire story a symbolic weight that goes far beyond romance or sci-fi spectacle. Aurora's arrival changes the emotional temperature of the film, but it does not erase its central symbolism. In many ways, she represents more than companionship. She represents the return of meaning, the return of human connection, the return of witness. Suddenly, Jim is no longer floating through an empty existence unseen. Another person is there, another consciousness, another soul. And that matters because human beings are not built merely to exist. We are built to be known. That may be the film's most haunting truth. Loneliness in Passengers is not only about being physically alone. It is about living without recognition, without intimacy, without another person to reflect your existence back to you. The film suggests that isolation does not just hurt because no one is nearby. It hurts because, in complete isolation, identity itself begins to erode. Who are you when no one sees you? Who do you become when no one speaks your name, challenges your choices, or shares your reality? Those questions sit underneath the film the entire time. And then there is the broader symbolic layer of space itself. In many science fiction films, space represents discovery, adventure, or the future of humanity. In Passengers, it also represents emotional exposure. It is vast, cold, and indifferent. It does not care about love, guilt, regret, or desperation. It simply surrounds the characters with silence. That silence becomes almost spiritual in its effect. It strips away distraction. It leaves only the human condition in its rawest form. No crowds, no noise, no social masks. Just a person, their choices, and the consequences of being alone too long. That is why the film's emotional tension feels so intimate despite its giant setting. The deeper conflict is not between humans and space. It is between humans and their own fragility. And that fragility is what makes the story resonate. Because whether or not we ever travel across galaxies, the fear at the center of Passengers is something painfully familiar. The fear of being cut off. The fear of being unseen. The fear that isolation might slowly hollow us out from the inside. The fear that, in desperation, we may become capable of choices we never imagined making. That is why the film lingers. Not because of the spaceship, not because of the romance, not even because of the controversy alone. It lingers because it touches something deeply human, the terrifying possibility that loneliness is not just an emotion, but a force that can reshape morality, distort hope, and expose just how fragile we really are beneath all our confidence and control. And once you start looking at Passengers through that symbolic lens, the film becomes much more than a futuristic love story. It becomes a quiet, unsettling meditation on isolation, and on how vulnerable a human soul becomes when it has no one left to hold on to except itself. At the center of Passengers lies a moment that completely transforms the story. It's not an explosion. It's not a system failure. It's not even a cosmic threat. It's a decision. And that decision becomes the moral gravity that pulls the entire film into uncomfortable territory. Because after months of isolation aboard the Avalon, after wandering empty corridors, eating alone, talking to machines, and realizing that rescue will never come, Jim Preston reaches a breaking point. 90 years remain before the ship reaches its destination. 90 years of silence. 90 years of watching the same artificial sunrise, walking the same empty halls, and knowing that every person who could save him is asleep just a few meters away, including Aurora Lane. And that's where the ethical dilemma begins. Jim discovers Aurora's hibernation pod and learns about her life through the ship's records. She's a writer, someone who chose the journey deliberately so she could document the experience and return to Earth decades later with stories no one else could tell. She has a future waiting for her, one she willingly sacrificed years of her life to achieve. But if Jim wakes her up, that future disappears. She will never reach the colony she dreamed of. She will never return home. She will live and die on a ship drifting through the darkness of space. And Jim knows that. That knowledge is what makes the decision so disturbing. This is not an accident. It's not a misunderstanding. It's not a desperate mistake made in seconds. The film shows him thinking about it, struggling with it, fighting against the temptation. Because he understands exactly what waking Aurora would mean. It would solve his loneliness, but it would destroy her destiny, and eventually, loneliness wins. That moment becomes the film's moral center, the point where Passengers stops being just a science fiction story and becomes something much more unsettling. Because what Jim does is neither easy to forgive nor easy to completely condemn. That's what makes the dilemma so powerful. On one level, his decision can feel deeply wrong. By waking Aurora, he effectively robs her of the life she chose. She becomes trapped in the same fate he's been suffering through, without ever having had the chance to consent to it. Viewed from that perspective, the act feels almost like a violation of autonomy. He has rewritten the course of another human being's life simply to escape his own isolation, and that's where many viewers draw a hard line. But the film complicates things by refusing to turn Jim into a simple villain. It shows the psychological erosion that led him there, months of isolation, the slow collapse of hope, the realization that no one will ever respond to his distress calls, the suffocating repetition of a life with no purpose and no future. The film places him in a situation that very few people could truly imagine surviving with their morality intact, and suddenly the question becomes much harder. Because the film isn't just asking whether Jim's decision is wrong. It's asking whether any human being could remain morally perfect under that kind of pressure. That's where the moral ambiguity becomes fascinating. Passengers doesn't present a clean ethical framework where right and wrong are easy to separate. Instead, it presents a human being pushed to the absolute limits of emotional endurance, and then asks the audience to judge what happens next. Was it selfish? Absolutely. Was it desperate? Also yes. And that tension is what makes the film linger. The story becomes even more complicated once Aurora wakes up. At first, she believes what Jim believed, that her pod simply malfunctioned. They share the same confusion, the same fear, the same search for solutions. Gradually, they begin to build a life together inside the silent ship. They talk. They laugh. They explore the Avalon's endless luxuries. Over time, companionship grows into intimacy. And that's where the ethical knot tightens even further, because the relationship feels real, the connection feels sincere, but it's built on a lie. Jim carries the secret of what he did, and every affectionate moment between them is shadowed by the knowledge that Aurora would never have chosen this life if she had known the truth. When the truth finally emerges, revealed through the android bartender Arthur rather than Jim himself, the emotional impact is devastating. Aurora doesn't just feel betrayed. She realizes that the entire relationship was constructed on a foundation she never agreed to. Love suddenly becomes something else entirely, something manipulated, something stolen, and the film doesn't rush to fix that rupture. Aurora's anger is intense and justified. The trust between them collapses. The Avalon, once a place where companionship softened the loneliness, becomes even colder than before. This is where Passengers truly leans into moral ambiguity. It refuses to present an easy redemption arc. Jim cannot undo what he has done. Aurora cannot erase the life that was taken from her. There is no version of the story where everything returns to normal. Instead, the characters are forced to confront the irreversible consequences of one human decision. And that's what makes the ethical dilemma so powerful. It's not about a villain plotting harm. It's about a flawed person making a catastrophic choice in a moment of emotional collapse. The film doesn't excuse that choice, but it also doesn't simplify it. And that's why audiences remain divided even years after the film's release. Some viewers see Jim's act as unforgivable, an act of selfishness so extreme that the romance which follows cannot redeem it. Others interpret the story as a tragic exploration of human desperation, where the moral lines blur because the circumstances themselves are unimaginable. But perhaps the most interesting thing about the film is that it refuses to settle the debate. It never declares Jim fully redeemed. It never declares him permanently condemned. Instead, it leaves the judgment hanging in space, suspended between empathy and discomfort. Because at its core, Passengers is not really asking whether Jim was right. It's asking something much more disturbing. If you were alone in deep space for 90 years, with no hope of rescue and no one left to speak to, would you truly have made a different choice? And the moment you hesitate before answering that question, the film has already done exactly what it set out to do. Before Passengers ever reached the screen, before the Avalon existed, before audiences debated its moral choices, the story spent years drifting through Hollywood without a home. And that journey, in many ways, mirrors the very premise of the film itself. Because the screenplay for Passengers didn't appear overnight. It actually existed long before the movie was ever made. Written by John Spates, the script quietly circulated around the industry for years. And almost immediately, it caught attention. Studios read it, producers discussed it, executives admired the concept. But despite all that interest, no one was quite ready to commit. The reason was simple, and a little surprising for a big Hollywood production. The story was considered too risky. At first glance, the premise sounded like a perfect sci-fi blockbuster, a massive interstellar ship, thousands of colonists asleep in hibernation, and a catastrophic malfunction that wakes someone 90 years too early. But once studios looked deeper into the script, they realized something unusual. For most of the movie, there are only two characters. That's it. In an era where science fiction films were built around large ensembles, constant action, and massive external threats, Passengers proposed something much quieter. Instead of alien invasions or galaxy-spanning battles, the story focused on a psychological dilemma between two people trapped inside a spaceship, and that made studios nervous. Big-budget science fiction is expensive. Massive sets, visual effects, and complex production design require enormous investment. Normally, those films balance that cost with spectacle, explosions, action sequences, large casts, and world-spanning stakes. But Passengers didn't promise that kind of spectacle. Instead, it offered something more intimate, a story about loneliness, a story about morality, a story about a human decision that could destroy another person's future. That kind of narrative is powerful, but it's also difficult to market. Studios worried audiences might expect a high-energy space adventure and instead find themselves watching a quiet, character-driven drama floating through the void. So for years, the script remained admired but unproduced. In Hollywood, there's actually a special place for scripts like this. Every year, industry professionals vote on their favorite unproduced screenplays, scripts that everyone respects but somehow never make it into production. That list is known as the blacklist, and Passengers appeared on it. That recognition is important, because the blacklist often highlights scripts with strong ideas but uncertain commercial appeal. In other words, stories that are bold, original, and just risky enough to scare studios away. And Passengers fit that description perfectly. But eventually, something changed. Momentum began to build around the project once major stars became interested. Suddenly, the same story that once looked like a financial gamble started to look like a high-profile event film. With recognizable actors attached, studios could see a path forward. The intimacy of the story became less of a liability and more of a selling point. Now the film could be marketed as something different. Not just another sci-fi spectacle, but a character-driven space drama with two major stars at its center. And that shift was crucial. Once the project gained that kind of star power, the long development period finally ended. The script that had spent years floating through the industry finally found its way into production. In a strange way, the film's own backstory reflects the themes inside it. Just like Jim drifting alone through the Avalon, the screenplay itself spent years drifting through Hollywood, admired, discussed, but waiting for the right moment to truly begin its journey. And when it finally did reach the screen, that long development history became part of the reason the film feels so unusual. Because Passengers was never designed to be a conventional blockbuster. From the very beginning, it was built around a risky idea. A massive science fiction setting, carrying a deeply intimate human story. A story that doesn't rely on alien threats or cosmic warfare. A story driven instead by loneliness, morality, and the consequences of one impossible decision. And the fact that Hollywood took years to decide whether to make that film tells you something important. Sometimes the most interesting stories aren't the ones that arrive easily. Sometimes they're the ones that take the longest to launch. One of the most impressive achievements in Passengers isn't the story, and it isn't even the performances. It's the ship. Because the Avalon doesn't just look like a spaceship, it feels like one, and that distinction is incredibly important. In many modern science fiction films, entire environments are created almost entirely through digital effects. Green screens replace real locations, actors perform inside empty spaces, and the world around them is added later through computer graphics. But Passengers took a different approach. The filmmakers wanted the Avalon to feel tangible, something the actors could physically interact with. Instead of building the ship purely in visual effects, the production team constructed enormous practical sets. Corridors, observation decks, living spaces, and social areas were designed as real environments that the actors could walk through, touch, and move inside. And that decision gives the entire film a sense of authenticity. The Avalon feels less like a digital background and more like a real place. A floating city designed for thousands of passengers who never even wake up during the journey. Its design balances futuristic elegance with functional realism. Everything looks luxurious but believable, as if it were built by a powerful corporation trying to sell interstellar travel as the ultimate luxury experience. Wide hallways stretch endlessly into polished silence. Massive windows reveal the quiet, terrifying beauty of space. Bars, restaurants, and lounges are designed with almost Art Deco elegance, turning the ship into something that feels less like a military vessel and more like a luxury cruise liner drifting through the cosmos. But what makes the design so effective is how it changes emotionally throughout the film. At first, the Avalon feels breathtaking. Its scale is impressive, its architecture elegant, its technology seamless. It represents the dream of humanity expanding into the stars. But the longer Jim remains alone aboard it, the more that beauty begins to shift. The same enormous spaces that once looked impressive begin to feel empty. The quiet luxury starts to resemble confinement. The ship slowly transforms from a symbol of progress into a symbol of isolation. And that transformation works precisely because the environment feels physically real. One of the most remarkable examples of this commitment to practical filmmaking is the famous rotating hallway sequence. Instead of relying solely on computer-generated effects to simulate shifting gravity, the production team built an enormous rotating cylinder set. The entire structure physically spun while the actors performed inside it. As the environment rotated around them, the actors ran along walls, flipped through the air, and struggled against changing gravity, all happening in a real, moving space. The result is incredibly immersive. You can feel the weight of the movement. You can sense the danger of losing balance. The scene doesn't look like a digital illusion because, in many ways, it isn't. It's a physical environment behaving exactly the way the story demands. That commitment to practical set design extends throughout the film. The interiors of the Avalon were carefully constructed to create a believable ecosystem, a ship that contains not only living quarters but also gardens, engineering sections, medical facilities, and social spaces. Every room reflects the idea that this vessel must support thousands of people for more than a century. Even the details matter. Furniture, lighting, materials, and textures all contribute to the ship's identity. Instead of sterile, metallic minimalism often seen in science fiction, the Avalon feels warm and inviting, a place designed to attract wealthy passengers willing to spend years traveling between worlds. But that warmth becomes ironic as the story unfolds. Because while the ship is designed for thousands of lives, it becomes home to only 2 waking people. And suddenly, the same design choices that made the Avalon feel luxurious now make it feel haunting. A grand dining hall designed for hundreds becomes a silent room for one. Observation decks built for crowds become lonely, viewing platforms staring into infinite darkness. A bar designed for lively conversation becomes the place where a single human speaks to an android bartender night after night. This is where the production design becomes more than just visual spectacle. It becomes storytelling. The ship itself begins reflecting Jim's emotional journey. As his loneliness grows, the Avalon stops feeling like a technological marvel and starts feeling like a vast echo chamber of isolation. That's the brilliance of the film's physical design. The sets are not simply there to look impressive. They shape the audience's emotional experience. They make the loneliness believable, the scale overwhelming, and the silence deeply unsettling. And that kind of immersive environment is incredibly difficult to achieve if everything exists only inside a computer. By building large portions of the Avalon as practical sets, the filmmakers grounded the entire movie in something physical. The actors weren't just pretending to be inside a spaceship. They were moving through real corridors, touching real surfaces, and performing inside real mechanical environments. That realism carries through the entire film. And it's one of the key reasons The World of Passengers feels so convincing. Because when the environment around a story feels real, the emotions inside that story become easier to believe. In the end, the Avalon isn't just a backdrop, it's a character. A massive, beautiful machine drifting silently through space, capable of sustaining thousands of lives, yet terrifyingly indifferent to the loneliness of the few who are awake inside it. One of the most fascinating aspects of Passengers isn't just the story unfolding aboard the Avalon, it's how the film actually brings space to life. Because portraying life in zero gravity is one of the most difficult technical challenges in science fiction filmmaking. You can't simply ask actors to float. You can't casually film weightlessness. And if the illusion fails even slightly, the audience notices immediately. That's why the filmmakers behind Passengers went to extraordinary lengths to make space feel physically believable. Instead of relying entirely on computer-generated effects, the production team combined practical techniques, mechanical rigs, and carefully choreographed movement to simulate zero gravity in a way that feels immersive rather than artificial. The actors themselves had to train extensively to perform these movements convincingly. Every gesture had to look slower, lighter, almost detached from normal physics. Even the way a character reaches for a surface or turns their body had to be recalibrated to mimic the absence of gravity. Wires were used to suspend performers in midair, allowing them to glide across rooms in ways that look natural within the film's environment. But using wires is only the beginning. Once actors are suspended, their movements must be controlled precisely. Too much motion and the illusion breaks. Too little and the scene feels stiff. So every movement became choreography. Actors, stunt coordinators, and camera operators worked together to create sequences where the body, the camera, and the environment all move in harmony. It's a complex dance designed to convince the audience that gravity has simply disappeared. And nowhere is this more impressive than in the film's most famous sequence, the zero-gravity pool scene. At first, the moment appears simple. Aurora swims in the ship's pool, enjoying a rare moment of relaxation inside the massive starship. But when the Avalon begins experiencing mechanical disturbances, the gravity system suddenly shuts down. In an instant, the water stops behaving like water. Instead of staying inside the pool, it lifts into the air. What follows is both visually stunning and genuinely terrifying. Aurora becomes trapped inside a floating sphere of water, unable to find a surface to push against, unable to orient herself, and unable to breathe. It's a moment that combines spectacle with pure panic, a reminder that even the ship's luxurious amenities can become deadly in space. Filming that scene was incredibly complicated. Water doesn't cooperate easily with special effects, especially when weightlessness is involved. To create the illusion, the filmmakers had to combine practical water effects with digital simulations. Massive rigs controlled the movement of the water, while sections of the sequence were filmed inside specially designed environments where the actors could interact with the floating mass in a controlled way. The result is one of the most memorable moments in the entire film. Not because it's loud or explosive, but because it feels real. You can sense the panic, you can feel the disorientation, and that authenticity comes directly from the film's commitment to practical filmmaking. But the technical ambition of Passengers doesn't stop there. Several other sequences required complex engineering to bring the Avalon's environment to life. As the ship begins experiencing cascading malfunctions later in the story, the carefully controlled luxury of the vessel begins to break down. Systems fail, gravity fluctuates, and entire sections of the ship become unstable. These moments demanded elaborate set pieces that blended mechanical rigs, practical stunts, and visual effects. The rotating hallway sequence is another perfect example. Instead of relying solely on digital trickery, the filmmakers built a massive rotating set, essentially a giant cylinder that spins while the actors move inside it. As the structure rotates, gravity appears to shift. Walls become floors, floors become ceilings. And suddenly the actors are running, flipping, and sliding across surfaces that constantly change orientation. Because the environment itself is physically rotating, the movement feels authentic. The actors react naturally because they are actually experiencing the shifting forces around them, and that realism translates directly onto the screen. The audience doesn't just see the chaos, they feel it. These kinds of technically demanding sequences serve an important purpose in the film. They remind us that the Avalon is not just a luxury cruise ship drifting peacefully through space. It is an enormous machine traveling through an unforgiving environment, and when something goes wrong, the consequences can escalate quickly. That tension becomes especially intense during the film's later survival sequences. As the ship's systems begin to fail, the scale of the crisis expands beyond personal drama and into life-or-death urgency. The characters must navigate dangerous environments, repair critical systems, and confront the terrifying reality that the entire mission could collapse if they fail. But even during these larger action moments, the film maintains a sense of physical realism. Every malfunction feels mechanical. Every danger feels tied to the ship's structure. The chaos never feels like abstract digital destruction. It feels like a real system breaking down piece by piece. And that is ultimately what makes the film's technical achievements so impressive. The filmmakers didn't just want space to look beautiful, they wanted it to behave believably. Through practical rigs, controlled environments, wire choreography, rotating sets, and carefully integrated visual effects, Passengers creates moments where the audience forgets they're watching a constructed illusion. Instead, it feels like we are truly inside the Avalon, watching gravity fail, machines malfunction, and human beings struggle to survive in a place where even the smallest technical problem can become deadly. And that commitment to realism turns the film's set pieces into something more than spectacle. It turns them into experiences. One of the first things that becomes clear while watching Passengers is that the film isn't just designed to tell a story. It's designed to create a feeling of scale, a feeling of beauty, and most importantly, a feeling of isolation. That emotional atmosphere is built almost entirely through the film's visual craft. From the cinematography to the visual effects, from the costume design to the lighting of the Avalon itself, every visual element works together to create a world that feels both breathtaking and quietly unsettling. Let's start with the cinematography. The camera treats the Avalon like a floating cathedral in space. Wide shots emphasize the vastness of the ship, showing enormous corridors, towering windows, and endless interior spaces that stretch into silence. These shots constantly remind us that the ship was designed for thousands of passengers, yet most of the time, only one or two people are awake inside it. And that contrast becomes powerful. The ship looks grand, but the characters look small. The camera often places Jim or Aurora in the center of massive empty spaces, visually reinforcing the loneliness that defines the story. Even when the environment is luxurious, the emptiness surrounding the characters gives those scenes an eerie, almost haunting tone. The Avalon isn't shot like a battlefield or a warship. It's shot like a monument to absence. And then there's the lighting. Instead of cold, sterile sci-fi illumination, the ship is filled with warm tones, golden reflections, soft highlights, and elegant interior lighting that feels more like a luxury hotel than a spacecraft. At first, this warmth makes the environment feel inviting. The ship feels like a dream of the future, comfortable, advanced, and designed to impress. But over time, that warmth becomes ironic. Because no matter how beautiful the lighting is, the silence of the ship remains. The glowing hallways, the polished surfaces, the elegant bars and lounges, all of it starts to feel like a stage waiting for people who never arrive. The cinematography captures that contradiction perfectly. The ship is stunning, and yet it feels lonely. The visual effects play a huge role in building that atmosphere as well. Instead of overwhelming the audience with constant explosions or flashy spectacle, the film uses effects more selectively. Space outside the Avalon is presented as vast, calm, and almost hypnotic. The stars drift slowly past the observation windows. Distant galaxies glow faintly in the background. The ship itself glides silently through an endless cosmic ocean. It's beautiful, but also slightly terrifying. Because the more peaceful space appears, the more isolated the characters feel inside it. The effects also enhance some of the film's most memorable moments, particularly when the Avalon begins to malfunction. Gravity shifts, systems break down, and the once perfect environment begins showing cracks. When chaos finally arrives, the visual effects become more aggressive, creating scenes where luxury collides with danger in dramatic ways. But even in those moments, the film maintains visual clarity. The spectacle never feels overwhelming or chaotic to the point of confusion. Instead, every effect is carefully designed to remain grounded in the ship's physical reality. Then there are the costumes, a subtle but important part of the film's world-building. Unlike many futuristic sci-fi films that lean heavily into flashy or exaggerated designs, Passengers takes a more restrained approach. The clothing worn by the characters feels elegant but practical, stylish but believable. Jim's wardrobe reflects his practical role as an engineer, while Aurora's outfits reflect her personality as a writer and explorer, someone drawn to experience, beauty, and curiosity. These costumes help anchor the characters inside the world of the Avalon. They remind us that this ship isn't just a piece of machinery. It's a commercial venture designed to transport wealthy passengers on a luxurious journey across the stars. Everything about the visual design reinforces that idea. The interiors resemble upscale resorts. The clothing reflects comfortable sophistication. The lighting feels warm and inviting. It's space travel designed not for survival, but for lifestyle. And that choice adds another layer to the atmosphere of the film. Because when the ship begins to malfunction, the environment doesn't simply become dangerous, it becomes tragic. The same elegant spaces that once symbolized humanity's technological triumph suddenly become fragile. Perfect corridors flicker with failing lights. Luxurious rooms fill with alarms and mechanical failures. The illusion of perfection begins to collapse, and visually, the film captures that transition beautifully. The atmosphere shifts from wonder to tension, from quiet elegance to creeping dread. But through all of these changes, the film never loses its visual identity. The cinematography, effects, costumes, and design elements all remain connected by one central idea. This is a story about two people inside a magnificent machine that was never meant to feel empty. That's what makes the visual craft of Passengers so effective. The beauty of the Avalon isn't just there to impress the audience. It's there to emphasize the loneliness of the characters trapped inside it. The grander the ship appears, the more isolated the human beings within it feel. And that contrast between beauty and emptiness becomes one of the most powerful visual themes in the entire film. Because in Passengers, Space isn't just vast, it's silent, and the visuals make sure we feel every second of that silence. While the massive sets, the stunning visuals, and the ambitious premise of Passengers often get most of the attention, there's another layer of craftsmanship quietly holding the entire film together, and that layer is the film's technical polish. Because beneath the story of loneliness and moral conflict lies a carefully constructed cinematic experience built through music, editing, and subtle technical precision. These elements may not always shout for attention, but they shape how the audience feels every moment of the journey. Let's begin with the music. The score for Passengers was composed by Thomas Newman, a composer known for creating soundtracks that feel deeply emotional without ever becoming overwhelming. Instead of pushing the film with loud orchestral intensity, Newman approaches the story with restraint. His music often feels delicate, reflective, almost melancholic. That choice is crucial, because the story of Passengers isn't driven by constant action or explosive spectacle. Much of the film unfolds in quiet moments. Jim walking alone through empty corridors, staring out into space, sitting in silence at a table meant for hundreds of people. In those scenes, the music doesn't dominate the emotion, it gently amplifies it. Soft piano notes, distant strings, and subtle atmospheric tones create a feeling of quiet melancholy. The score mirrors the emotional isolation of the characters, reinforcing the sense that they are drifting through a beautiful but lonely world. When the film moves into more intense moments, system failures, dangerous repairs, life-threatening crises, the music grows stronger, but it never loses that emotional sensitivity. Even in moments of suspense, the score remains connected to the character's emotional state rather than simply becoming background noise for action. That balance is one of the reasons the film feels so cohesive. The music doesn't just accompany the visuals, it breathes with them. Then, there's the editing, another element that quietly shapes the film's tone. The pacing of Passengers is intentionally measured, especially during the early sections when Jim is alone aboard the Avalon. The editing allows scenes to linger longer than we might expect in a traditional blockbuster. We watch routines repeat. We see the same environments from different emotional perspectives. Time feels slow, almost heavy. That editing choice serves an important narrative purpose. It allows the audience to feel Jim's isolation rather than simply understand it intellectually. The slow rhythm of these sequences makes the passage of time tangible. The emptiness of the ship becomes more unsettling because the film isn't rushing to escape it, and when Aurora finally enters the story, the editing subtly shifts. Scenes become more dynamic. Conversations replace silence. The pace of the film begins to move with a little more energy, reflecting the emotional transformation happening between the characters. This is editing used not just for storytelling clarity, but for emotional storytelling. Later in the film, when the Avalon begins experiencing system failures, the rhythm changes again. The editing becomes sharper, faster, more urgent. Moments of quiet contemplation give way to sequences of escalating danger. But even then, the film maintains a sense of spatial clarity. The audience always understands where the characters are inside the ship and how the crisis is unfolding. That kind of clarity is a sign of strong technical control, because large-scale science fiction films can easily become visually overwhelming when chaos erupts. But Passengers maintains its composure. The editing keeps the story focused on the characters rather than letting spectacle completely dominate the narrative. All of these elements, the music, the editing, the pacing, contribute to what we might call the film's overall technical polish. Everything feels carefully constructed. The cinematography works seamlessly with the score. The editing supports the emotional rhythm of the story. The visual effects integrate smoothly with the physical sets. Even the smaller details, like sound design and environmental ambiance, reinforce the sense that the Avalon is a real machine drifting silently through space. That polish matters, because Passengers depends heavily on immersion. The audience needs to believe in the environment. We need to feel like we are inside this ship, experiencing the same quiet tension as the characters. If any of the technical elements felt sloppy or disconnected, that illusion would collapse. But instead, the film maintains a consistent level of craftsmanship from beginning to end. Even viewers who criticize the story often acknowledge this aspect of the film. The production design, the cinematography, the score, and the editing all work together with a level of professionalism that gives the movie a sleek, almost elegant identity. It's not chaotic science fiction, it's controlled science fiction. Every frame feels deliberate, every scene feels composed, and that technical discipline helps elevate the emotional experience of the film. Because when a movie is crafted with this level of precision, the audience isn't constantly reminded that they're watching a production. Instead, we become absorbed in the world itself. The empty corridors, the distant stars, the quiet conversations, and the slowly unfolding tension between two people trapped together in a place that was never meant to feel so lonely. That's the power of technical polish. It doesn't just make a film look good, it makes the entire experience feel real. One of the boldest creative decisions in Passengers is something most big science fiction films would never attempt. Despite its massive spaceship, futuristic technology, and interstellar setting, the story is essentially carried by just two characters. That's a huge risk. Most blockbuster sci-fi films rely on large ensembles, teams of astronauts, scientists, soldiers, or entire civilizations. Those stories expand outward, filling the screen with multiple perspectives and constant interaction. But Passengers does the opposite. Instead of expanding, it contracts. Instead of showing thousands of people exploring space, it focuses almost entirely on two individuals trapped inside a silent ship. And that creative choice shapes the entire emotional experience of the film. For much of the story, the camera rarely strays far from Jim Preston and Aurora Lane. The Avalon might be enormous, capable of carrying thousands of passengers, but from a storytelling perspective, it becomes an incredibly intimate stage. Two people, one ship, and an impossible situation between them. This structure forces the audience to stay close to the characters in a way many sci-fi films never attempt. There are no large teams solving problems together. There are no side plots constantly pulling the narrative in different directions. The emotional focus remains locked on Jim and Aurora. Their choices, their conflict, their fragile attempts to build meaning inside an empty world. That intimacy gives the film a very unusual tone for a large-scale production. It feels almost theatrical at times, like a chamber drama unfolding inside a futuristic setting. And because the cast is so small, every performance carries enormous weight. Chris Pratt's character spends a significant portion of the film alone before Aurora even enters the story. During that time, the movie depends entirely on his ability to hold the audience's attention while wandering through empty environments, struggling with isolation, and slowly confronting the psychological toll of being the only conscious human aboard the ship. When Aurora finally wakes up, the dynamic shifts dramatically. The story becomes less about survival and more about human interaction. Conversations replace silence. The ship's spaces begin to feel less oppressive because they are now shared. But the relationship between Jim and Aurora is not simple companionship. It's built on a complicated foundation. One person chose to wake the other. One person had their future taken from them. That imbalance becomes the emotional engine driving their interactions. Every moment between them carries layers: curiosity, affection, suspicion, anger, forgiveness. And because there are so few characters in the story, those emotional shifts feel magnified. There's nowhere to hide from them. That's the power of the film's two-character structure. It forces the audience to sit with the characters, their mistakes, their vulnerability, and their complicated attempts to reconcile what has happened. But while the film is dominated by Jim and Aurora, the supporting cast still plays an important role in shaping the emotional landscape. Even brief appearances add texture to the otherwise intimate narrative. One of the most memorable supporting presences is Arthur, the ship's android bartender. Played with calm charm and quiet wit, Arthur becomes something of a strange emotional companion for Jim. He's always there behind the bar, always ready to listen, always capable of offering perfectly measured advice. But Arthur is also fundamentally different from the humans around him. He observes everything but judges nothing. He understands the facts of Jim's situation, yet he lacks the moral framework to recognize the weight of Jim's choices. That neutrality makes him a fascinating presence in the story. In many ways, he becomes a mirror for the audience, someone who witnesses the unfolding drama without fully grasping its emotional consequences. Later in the film, another character briefly enters the narrative when Chief Deck Officer Gus Mancuso awakens from hibernation due to the ship's failing systems. Though his screen time is limited, his presence shifts the dynamic of the story in important ways. He brings authority, experience, and a sense of reality back into the situation. For a short time, Jim and Aurora are no longer the only people awake. Someone else understands the ship. Someone else recognizes the danger building beneath the surface. That brief expansion of the cast reminds us that the Avalon is meant to be filled with life, thousands of lives. Yet for almost the entire journey of the film, that life remains locked away in sleep. The supporting characters also serve another purpose. They reinforce just how isolated the main characters truly are. Every time a new face appears, even briefly, it reminds the audience how long Jim and Aurora have been trapped inside their own emotional orbit. Two people sharing a vast world that was never meant to be inhabited by so few. In the end, the intimate structure of Passengers is what gives the story its unique identity. It's not a sweeping space epic filled with dozens of characters navigating cosmic events. It's something quieter, something more personal. A massive sci-fi setting used as the backdrop for a deeply human story about loneliness, connection, betrayal, and forgiveness. And by limiting the number of voices inside the story, the film ensures that every word spoken between Jim and Aurora carries weight. Because when there are only two people left awake in the universe, every conversation becomes everything. At the heart of Passengers, beyond the spaceship, beyond the visual spectacle, beyond the philosophical debate, there are two performances carrying almost the entire emotional weight of the film. Chris Pratt as Jim Preston, Jennifer Lawrence as Aurora Lane. And the truth is, this movie simply does not work without them. Because when a story isolates two characters inside a massive, empty environment, there's nowhere for weak performances to hide. There are no large ensembles to share the emotional burden, no constant action sequences to distract from the characters themselves. Everything depends on whether the audience believes these two people, their loneliness, their choices, their anger, their forgiveness, and most importantly, their transformation. Let's start with Jim Preston. Chris Pratt plays Jim in a way that is surprisingly restrained compared to many of his other roles. Audiences often associate Pratt with humor, charisma, and confident heroism, but here, much of that is stripped away. Jim is not a swaggering adventurer. He's an ordinary man thrown into an extraordinary nightmare, and the film spends a long time showing us that nightmare. When Jim first wakes up on the Avalon, his performance captures the slow psychological shift from confusion to realization. At first, there's curiosity. He explores the ship, tries to contact the crew, assumes the situation will be fixed quickly. But as days turn into weeks, and weeks turn into months, the optimism disappears. Pratt gradually transforms Jim into someone emotionally exhausted. The loneliness begins to settle into his posture, his voice, his eyes. The humor fades, the silence grows heavier, and eventually we see the breaking point, the moment where isolation begins to erode his judgment. This evolution is crucial to understanding the character, because Jim is not written as a villain, but he is also not written as a hero. He is something much more uncomfortable, a flawed human being placed in an impossible situation. Pratt plays that moral ambiguity carefully. He shows guilt, he shows desperation. He shows the internal conflict between knowing what is right and wanting to escape unbearable loneliness. That internal struggle becomes the emotional core of the first half of the film. Then Aurora enters the story. Jennifer Lawrence's performance introduces a completely different energy into the narrative. Where Jim has spent months sinking into silence, Aurora arrives with curiosity, intelligence, and emotional intensity. She brings life back into the Avalon. Lawrence gives Aurora a sharp sense of individuality. She's not simply a romantic interest dropped into the story. She's a journalist, an observer of the world, someone driven by experience and curiosity. Even trapped inside the ship, she tries to understand the situation, investigate solutions, and document what she's living through. Her presence shifts the entire emotional tone of the film. Conversations replace silence, exploration replaces routine. And gradually, the relationship between Jim and Aurora begins to develop. At first, their connection feels natural. Two strangers trapped together in an impossible situation slowly find comfort in each other's company. Their chemistry feels genuine, which is essential for the story to work. The audience needs to believe that these two people could fall for each other under these circumstances. But the film never allows that relationship to remain simple, because once Aurora discovers the truth that Jim deliberately woke her from hibernation, the emotional dynamic between them changes instantly, and this is where Lawrence's performance becomes particularly powerful. Her reaction isn't mild disappointment, it's devastation. Aurora realizes that her entire future has been stolen. The life she chose, the mission she volunteered for, the decades she expected to spend traveling toward a new world, all of it was taken away by the person she trusted the most. Laurence plays that moment with raw anger and betrayal. The warmth that once defined her character turns into something colder. The ship that had begun to feel like a shared adventure suddenly becomes a prison again, and the relationship between the two leads fractures completely. What makes this performance dynamic so compelling is that the characters continue evolving even after that rupture. The story doesn't simply reset their relationship or rush toward forgiveness. Instead, both characters must confront the consequences of what has happened. Jim must live with the guilt of what he did. Aurora must decide whether forgiveness is even possible. Their emotional journeys begin moving in parallel, sometimes clashing, sometimes reconnecting, always shaped by the irreversible decision that started the entire conflict. This evolution is what gives the film its emotional depth. The characters don't remain static. Jim begins the story as a victim of circumstance, but becomes someone responsible for a morally troubling act. Aurora begins as an innocent participant in the voyage, but becomes someone forced to grapple with betrayal, anger, and the painful possibility of reconciliation. And as the ship itself begins experiencing catastrophic failures later in the story, the characters must confront an entirely new challenge: survival. Now their emotional conflict is no longer the only crisis. They must work together, repair systems, prevent the Avalon from collapsing, and in the process, their relationship begins transforming again, not into the naive romance it once was, but into something more complicated, something shaped by pain, sacrifice, and understanding. That complexity is why the lead performances matter so much. Without Pratt and Laurence grounding the characters in genuine emotion, the film's moral dilemma might feel abstract or artificial. Instead, their performances make the story feel human. We see the desperation, we feel the betrayal, and we witness the slow, uneasy transformation of two people forced to live with the consequences of a choice neither of them can undo. Because in the end, Passengers is not just a story about space travel or futuristic technology. It's a story about people, about how isolation changes them, about how love and guilt can exist at the same time, and about how two individuals must evolve, painfully, imperfectly, if they hope to survive both the physical dangers of space and the emotional wreckage left behind by one irreversible decision. In a film built around two isolated human beings drifting through deep space, there is one other presence that quietly shapes the emotional rhythm of the story. He's not human. He doesn't feel loneliness. He doesn't experience guilt. And yet, in many ways, he becomes one of the most fascinating characters in Passengers. That character is Arthur, the impeccably polite android bartender played by Michael Sheen. At first, Arthur seems like little more than part of the ship's luxury experience. He stands behind the Avalon's elegant bar, ready to mix perfect drinks, engage in polite conversation, and provide the kind of effortless hospitality expected on a high-end interstellar cruise. But once Jim wakes up alone aboard the ship, Arthur becomes something much more important. He becomes Jim's only consistent companion, and that relationship immediately creates a strange dynamic. Arthur is designed to interact with passengers, to listen, to respond intelligently. He can hold conversations, tell stories, even offer advice. But there's one critical difference between Arthur and the humans around him. Arthur understands information, but he does not understand morality, and that distinction turns him into a fascinating presence within the story. For Jim, Arthur becomes a kind of emotional outlet. In a ship where every other human being is asleep, Arthur is the only one capable of responding to conversation. Jim can sit at the bar, talk about his frustration, joke about his situation, and attempt to maintain some sense of normalcy. But Arthur is not a friend in the traditional sense. He doesn't judge. He doesn't empathize. He simply responds, and that neutrality is both comforting and unsettling at the same time. In many ways, Arthur acts as an observer of the entire story. He witnesses Jim's loneliness. He hears his thoughts. He sees the choices being made. But because he lacks emotional understanding, he never recognizes the deeper implications of what he's observing. He's like a mirror reflecting human behavior without interpreting it. That becomes especially important when Aurora enters the story. Once Jim wakes her up, The emotional tension between the two characters begins to grow beneath the surface. Their relationship develops, deepens, and eventually becomes romantic. But the truth about how Aurora came to be awake is still hidden, and Arthur knows that truth. Yet from his perspective, there is nothing morally complex about it. To Arthur, information is simply information. If a guest asks a question, he answers it honestly. There is no concept of betrayal, no understanding that revealing certain facts could destroy a relationship. So when Aurora eventually asks Arthur about Jim, Arthur tells the truth, not maliciously, not carelessly, simply factually. And in doing so, he unknowingly detonates the emotional bomb at the center of the story. That moment reveals exactly what Arthur represents in the narrative. He is the perfect observer, someone who sees everything but understands nothing about the human weight behind it. That makes him an incredibly effective storytelling device. Because Arthur doesn't just function as a bartender or comic relief. He acts as a tonal counterpoint to the emotional turmoil unfolding around him. While Jim struggles with guilt, Arthur remains calm. While Aurora feels betrayal and anger, Arthur remains polite. While the human characters are drowning in complicated emotions, Arthur stands behind the bar with the same composed smile he always wears. That contrast highlights one of the film's deeper themes. Human beings are messy. We make emotional decisions. We justify our mistakes. We hide uncomfortable truths. Arthur cannot do any of those things. He is perfectly logical, perfectly transparent, and completely incapable of understanding the moral consequences of the information he shares. And that's what makes his presence both amusing and tragic. Amusing, because his polite charm and dry humor add moments of lightness to an otherwise heavy story. Tragic, because his inability to recognize emotional damage makes him the instrument through which the story's biggest revelation occurs. Michael Sheen's performance adds another layer to this dynamic. He plays Arthur with a smooth, almost theatrical charm that makes the character immediately likable. His calm voice, relaxed posture, and effortless hospitality make Arthur feel like the perfect host in a world where hospitality is almost meaningless. But beneath that charm lies the unsettling truth that Arthur is not truly participating in the human drama around him. He's observing it, recording it, reflecting it, without ever feeling it. In that sense, Arthur becomes a symbolic contrast to the human characters in the film. Jim and Aurora are overwhelmed by emotion, loneliness, guilt, love, anger, forgiveness. Their lives are shaped by feelings that can't be calculated or predicted. Arthur exists outside that chaos. He operates on logic, clarity, and simple programmed responses. And by placing this perfectly composed artificial intelligence in the middle of a deeply emotional human conflict, Passengers creates one of its most interesting contrasts, a machine that understands everything except what it means to be human. Before Passengers becomes a story about moral choices, broken trust, and survival in deep space, it begins with something that feels almost hopeful, a dream. The dream of humanity leaving Earth behind and building a new future among the stars. But the way this dream is presented in the film is fascinating, because it isn't framed as a heroic government mission or a scientific expedition. Instead, it's something much more familiar to our modern world. It's corporate. The journey to the distant colony known as Homestead 2 is not led by astronauts or explorers representing humanity. It's organized by a massive corporation called the Homestead Company, a company that has essentially turned interstellar travel into a luxury product. Thousands of passengers have purchased tickets. Hundreds of crew members are on board to maintain the ship, and everyone is placed into hibernation for the 120-year journey across space. From a distance, it feels like the ultimate vacation package, except instead of traveling across oceans, passengers are traveling across galaxies. That setup immediately introduces one of the film's most interesting ideas, the commercialization of space. The Avalon is not just a spaceship. It's a floating city designed for comfort. The ship is filled with luxury suites, restaurants, entertainment centers, observation decks, gardens, and recreational facilities. Everything about it suggests a company trying to sell the idea of space colonization as a premium lifestyle experience. The passengers themselves are not desperate refugees fleeing Earth. Many of them are adventurers, entrepreneurs, or wealthy individuals seeking opportunity on a distant world. They've signed contracts, purchased their passage, and willingly chosen to leave everything behind in order to build something new. But there's a catch, a massive one. Because the trip to Homestead 2 takes 120 years. No human being will live long enough to experience the journey consciously. That's why every passenger and crew member is placed inside a hibernation pod. These pods suspend their bodies in a deep sleep, preserving them until the ship reaches its destination. For the passengers, the experience feels almost instantaneous. They fall asleep on Earth and wake up on another planet. But that illusion of simplicity hides an incredible level of technological dependence. The entire mission relies on automated systems functioning perfectly for more than a century. The Avalon must maintain life support, navigate through space, avoid hazards, repair damage, and sustain thousands of sleeping human beings, all without active human supervision. It's a breathtaking achievement of engineering, and also an incredibly fragile one. Because when something goes wrong, there is no crew awake to fix it, no passengers conscious to react. The entire mission becomes dependent on machines designed to operate flawlessly for generations. That's where the film's central setup becomes so powerful. The Avalon is essentially a floating civilization in suspended animation. 5,000 lives, hundreds of crew members, all asleep, all trusting a machine to carry them safely across the universe. And then one small malfunction changes everything. 30 years into the journey, the ship is struck by debris, a meteor impact that disrupts its systems just enough to trigger a catastrophic error. One hibernation pod opens prematurely, waking a passenger 90 years before the ship is scheduled to arrive. That passenger is Jim Preston. From the moment Jim steps out of the pod, the entire mission transforms. What was meant to be a perfectly controlled corporate voyage suddenly becomes a nightmare scenario. The ship is still functioning, still traveling through space, still carrying thousands of sleeping people toward their destination. But Jim is awake, alone, trapped inside a machine designed for crowds, and that's where the true isolation of the story begins. The Avalon becomes a ghost city, a place built for life but inhabited by silence. The restaurants still operate. The automated systems still greet passengers cheerfully. Orientation videos still play, but there is no crew, no passengers, no living society inside the ship. Just one man walking through spaces designed for thousands. This setup is brilliant because it blends two powerful ideas together. First, the ambition of humanity reaching beyond Earth, and second, the vulnerability of trusting technology to carry that ambition safely across the stars. The Homestead mission represents humanity's optimism, the belief that we can build new worlds, create new societies, and expand beyond the limits of our home planet. But Jim's situation reveals the terrifying fragility beneath that dream. Because when you remove the people from a civilization and leave only the machines running it, what remains is not progress, it's silence. And that silence becomes the emotional foundation for everything that follows in Passengers. One of the most interesting things about Passengers is how its story constantly transforms. At first, the film feels like one kind of movie. Then, it slowly becomes something else, and by the end, it has evolved again. Instead of following a single genre from beginning to end, Passengers moves through several emotional stages, each one reshaping the tone of the story. The narrative begins in silence, grows into companionship, fractures through betrayal, and finally explodes into survival. And that progression is what keeps the film unpredictable. The first phase, solitude. The story opens in almost eerie quiet. Jim Preston wakes up 90 years too early on the starship Avalon, a vessel carrying 5,000 sleeping passengers to a distant colony world. At first, the situation feels like a glitch that will soon be corrected. The ship is beautiful, luxurious, fully functional. Automated systems greet him cheerfully. Restaurants open at the touch of a button. Orientation videos assure him everything is normal. But gradually, the truth becomes unavoidable. No one else is awake. The crew is asleep. The passengers are asleep, and the ship's systems won't allow him to access the areas that might fix the problem. The Avalon becomes a floating ghost city. For months, Jim wanders its endless corridors alone. He eats meals designed for crowds but sits at the table by himself. He walks through grand spaces that echo with silence. The film lingers on this loneliness, allowing the audience to feel the slow psychological erosion that comes from being the only conscious human being aboard a vessel meant for thousands. This phase of the story is quiet, introspective, and deeply uncomfortable. It's not about action. It's about isolation. The second phase, romance. Then everything changes. Jim notices Aurora Lane, still asleep in her hibernation pod. He reads her passenger profile, watches her recorded interviews, and becomes fascinated by the person she is. Aurora is a writer, someone who volunteered for the journey so she could experience the unknown and document humanity's expansion into the stars. But there's a problem. If Jim wakes her up, she will never reach that future. She will live and die on the ship. The film spends time showing Jim struggle with this decision, wrestling with the moral weight of condemning another person to his fate. But eventually, loneliness wins. Aurora wakes up believing her pod malfunctioned, just like Jim's did. Now the tone of the story changes dramatically. The silent ship becomes alive again. Conversations replace solitude. Shared meals, walks through the ship, and quiet moments watching the stars begin to build a connection between them. Friendship slowly grows into romance. For a while, the Avalon feels less like a prison and more like an unexpected life shared between two people drifting through space. The third phase, betrayal. But that fragile happiness is built on a lie. Aurora doesn't know that Jim made the choice to wake her. She believes fate brought them together, and the truth eventually finds its way to the surface. When Aurora discovers what really happened, the emotional atmosphere of the film shifts instantly. What once felt like companionship now feels like manipulation. The person she trusted the most has stolen her future. Her reaction is explosive. The warmth between them disappears. The Avalon becomes cold again. But this time, the silence between them feels even heavier than the solitude that came before. Now there are two people awake on the ship, and they can barely stand to look at each other. This is the most emotionally intense phase of the story, where love and betrayal collide in a deeply uncomfortable way. The final phase, survival. Just when the emotional conflict feels overwhelming, the narrative shifts once again. The Avalon begins to fail. What started as a single malfunction slowly reveals a much larger problem. The meteor impact that woke Jim has caused cascading damage throughout the ship's systems. Power failures spread. Critical machinery begins breaking down. The entire vessel and the 5,000 sleeping lives inside it are in danger. Now the story becomes something else entirely. A survival story. Despite their personal conflict, Jim and Aurora are forced to work together to prevent the ship from collapsing. The emotional battle between them becomes secondary to a much larger crisis. They must repair systems, confront dangerous environments, and attempt to save a mission that could end in disaster. The Avalon transforms again, from lonely sanctuary to failing machine. And the characters must confront not only their fractured relationship, but the possibility that everything around them could be lost. A story that evolves. This progression, solitude, romance, betrayal, and survival, gives passengers a unique narrative rhythm. Instead of remaining static, the film keeps shifting its emotional focus, constantly revealing new layers of the story. What begins as a meditation on loneliness becomes a complicated love story. What appears to be a romance turns into a moral crisis. And what feels like a personal drama suddenly expands into a battle to save thousands of lives. Each stage builds on the one before it, creating a story that moves through multiple emotional landscapes while always returning to the same central question: what happens when a single human decision changes everything? Because in Passengers, the greatest danger isn't just the malfunctioning ship. It's the consequences of one choice that can never be undone. One of the most fascinating conversations surrounding Passengers didn't start in the movie itself. It started after people watched it. Because when the film ended, many viewers walked away thinking about something unusual. Not just what the story was, but how the story was told. And that sparked a debate that continues to this day. A debate about narrative perspective. Because Passengers tells its story primarily through Jim's point of view. We wake up when he wakes up. We explore the empty Avalon with him,